Hello, Giants fans. Welcome to Giants Baseball 101. I'm Gabe Vaughn, your host. Now, of the 5 remaining games until the trade deadline, here's the question for today. Of those 5 remaining games, how many would the Giants have to win in order to convince the front office to buy this year? And you'd probably look at that, and maybe the average fan would say about 3 out of the 5 remaining games. Maybe some of you who are maybe really optimistic would say 2 would be good enough because they're proving at least they can win, and maybe the front office would decide, particularly Farhan Zaidi would decide that what they need is just veteran additions to their roster. Well, I say veteran, but they got to be young enough, right? But these really good superstar additions to the roster, and that'll propel the team. So maybe some would go with an estimate of 2, but otherwise we would probably say they'd have to win at least 3 games at this point. And that is the amount of games they are back of a wild card spot, but if they won, like say 3 out of the next 5 games, they would also lose 2. So that doesn't quite get them there, but it'd just be a trust in the team, basically, with the addition of whoever the Giants would add, that they would make it in the next couple of months, that they would catch up. But before we really attempt to dive into that, let me clarify another unfortunate reality. It's not like you either buy or sell at the trade deadline. There are teams that do a little of both. And I've heard talk about that here's what it's not like. It's not like you always trade all your good prospects to go for this specific year, or you trade all your players who are nearing the end of the contracts, trade your good guys just to get prospects for the future, and it's all about rebuilding the system. It's not like it's always one of the two. Now, you might think you already know that, but if you're still thinking that it's like you either buy or sell and just not to the maximum degree, and that's true, that sometimes you'll trade for a player but you want to keep some prospects. You're like maintaining a balance between contention this year and contention next year and a few years when you can get your prospects ready, where you could decide to buy, but you're totally on the buying side, but you're careful to conserve some prospects in your farm system. And really every team, that's the case with every team. They're going to want to conserve that farm system a little bit. Sorry, I got twisted a little there. They'll want to conserve their farm system for the next few years, for the future. But there are still greater or lesser extents in how much you're going after it, how much you're going to buy. Like to get Juan Soto, for one thing, the Giants would have to trade a lot. They'd have to go stronger after him than to get, say, I would say really to get anybody who's above average, but maybe not one of the top names on the trade list. I should mention the other guy who's up for grabs now, at least might be up for grabs, is Shohei Otani from the Angels. And he has... what can I say about that? He has what the Giants need. He can pitch, and he can hit. He can hit home runs. He slugs. He hits very well. But oh boy, is he really good on the mound. Shohei Otani, even though I haven't heard any talk about the Giants getting him, I'm saying myself, he's the guy the Giants need. What else can we say about that? They're hitting and they're pitching. That would kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Either as a DH or as a pitcher without even having the other half of his value. He'd be a great player. And the Giants would get him, and what would they have? They gotta look after Shohei Otani. I hope I hear talk about that. I hope that it's not just me who's thinking of a thing like that for the Giants. But I did interrupt myself from talking about what is the real balance between selling and buying, and I mentioned that buying, sometimes you'll be a team that doesn't want to go all in. You especially do want to save your farm system, and yet you maybe do want to add like 1 or 2 guys, and it'd be the same thing with selling. So you could be like, we're going to trade this guy and that guy, but these guys we're going to save just in case the team would have a playoff chance, but that will also allow us to build up the farm system for the future. But even that is not the only, those things are not the only options, because they could do both buying and selling. That is really the third thing here. So I'm not just talking about moderate buying or moderate selling. I'm really talking about a little bit of both. And an example would be, go back with me to 2019. What did they do at the trade deadline there? First of all, what was all the talk about? Who were the two guys? Both were pitchers. Who were the two guys the Giants had that there was all the trade talk about? Well, it was Madison Bumgarner and Will Smith. And it was certain they'd be traded a little earlier in the season. Then the Giants had that hot streak in 2019. At the trade deadline, what did Farhan Zaidi decide to do? He decided to keep them. That's exactly what I wanted him to do. Although, as we have seen, they didn't make the playoffs that year. They would have, I think, if the Giants had been even more aggressive. Okay, so what did they do in 2019? A couple of their pretty good relievers, Sam Dyson and Mark Melancon, were traded for prospect considerations. That's how they got prospects in 2019. Even though it was clearly a contending year, it had changed, really, from a rebuild year to a contending year. Zaidi still traded Dyson and Melancon to get prospects for the team. The Giants also added on a player, not anyone that turned out to be a very good one. They added on Scooter Gennett from the Reds. And I think it was more than just a disappointment the way he performed that year. I really think if the Giants had looked at his earlier 2019 statistics, from what I remember, they could have reasonably concluded that he just wasn't very promising. The only reason for getting him would have been that he was a previous superstar for the Reds, but he had struggled with injuries earlier in 2019, so I just feel like if they'd asked me about Scooter Gennett, I think I would have had a bit of foresight there and just said, okay, probably not. But anyway, it's what Zaidi decided to do in 2019. That the Giants, they just didn't make the postseason that year. And now let's go to 2021. What's the difference? They weren't on the outside looking in. They were on the inside looking deep in. They were totally in contention in 2021. I still don't think the Giants did as well at the trade deadline as they really could have, but what did it matter, at least in terms of the regular season? They won the division. If they had done better, could they have done better in the postseason? We'll never know. That's what I always say. They traded for Chris Bryant. Chris Bryant certainly performed above replacement level. I think above the major league average, but he certainly didn't perform well in 2021 based on the average Chris Bryant. Compare Bryant to Bryant himself as he was the rest of his career. Did the Giants really get the value that they traded for in 2021? No, it did not seem like it. But the difference between the 2 years, whatever we think about how it went, is that in 2019 they did a little bit of both, selling and buying. You see a first-hand example of how that worked. And this year is similar to 2019. It's also kind of similar to 2018, when the Giants did basically nothing, which I think that was bad. Of course, they didn't have the benefit of the extra National League wildcard spot, so it would have been harder anyway, in either of those years, really. Okay, but now we're in 2022. And I've heard a lot of talk. What if they just took a moderate approach? A little bit of selling, a little bit of buying to just try to get the best on-field roster that they could without really hurting the farm system. I would say basically preparing for the future, but, maybe a little for 2022. And I think we can answer the question about how many games would the Giants need to win in order to prove to the farm system that buying was the right thing to do. So before we do that, I want to share my opinion. I don't think the Giants can make it unless they buy at the trade deadline and unless they go all in. I'm definitely very concerned about that they might decide to sell and even to trade Carlos Rodon and maybe more. But there's a little more. My concern actually goes a bit deeper than that. Even if they didn't decide to sell and to sell out this year, which that'd basically be doing, they could decide to be too moderate and it would end up, the end result would be they don't put together a good enough roster to, yeah, there's that siren. Something happens every day. Yeah. Anyway, keep the train of thought. So, what were we talking about? I'm sure you could have heard me, just wanted to wait till all distractions were out. Like to do that when possible. So anyway, I'm concerned the Giants could decide to be too moderate, even if they don't decide to completely sell out on the year. And if they did that, if they decided to become moderate, what would that look like? Well, has it really worked for the Giants before? They didn't get to the postseason in 2018. They didn't get there in 2019 either. Do I have a... Oh, and they didn't get there in 2020, even though they had an 8-team postseason in each league. So now, we got a 6-team postseason, and the way I understand it, the way it works is the last place team to win the division, like the team that wins the division but is last in the record of division winners, they'll have to play the last wild card spot. Then the first and second wild card spots will play, so there are technically 3 wild card spots. I think I figured out now how the postseason bracket would work, but the main point is there's an extra National League wild card spot. Still, extra spot and all. The Giants, if they decide to be moderate at the trade deadline, even if they don't completely sell out, if they don't go after the best players that are really available and could be reasonably priced for them, I just don't see how this thing's going to work. So that's what I'm concerned about. If the Giants do well in the rest of this series against the Cubs, it may be enough to prove to Farhan's Zaidi not to sell out completely. But the way the roster's looking right now, they come into the second half of the season and they are still a game below 500. And I'm just saying all of that to say clearly what I believe is necessary for a playoff run, which is an all-out buying approach, looking at the best players they can get at the trade deadline. It's just what I believe is necessary. Is there a reason, do you think, that the Giants no longer seem to be, well, I mean, I've read very limited stuff in recent days about this, but the Giants don't really seem to be one of the top teams in the Juan Soto trade talk now. Now, I did hear a little bit of talk recently about, I think in a couple of places, about the Giants possibly getting Wilson Contreras for the Cubs. I think he'd be a great option, whether he'd be the catcher or just stick in the lineup as the designated hitter. That I'm not quite sure, but anyway. He is an option, but the Giants are not really up there on the Juan Soto trade talk anymore. And it just seems to be becoming a problem because I think they need to realistically be looking at the best players that are going to be on the market at the trade deadline. So, how many games would they need to win out of 5 for there to be a real chance of the Giants doing buying and pretty much only that? Well, it is a pretty good guess. They would need to win at least 3. I think they should buy, even if they win like 1 or 2, because they need roster additions so bad, and that might be what makes all the difference. But you know, it's just even on the MLB.com predictions about what each team should do at the trade deadline. I saw, and can you believe it? I saw what was advised on MLB.com by a reporter was that the Giants trade Carlos Rodon. Can you believe it? That was before the win last night. That was after they got swept by the Diamondbacks, of course. Also of concern is the fact that after the Cubs leave town, the Dodgers come in. So the Giants are going to have to play the Dodgers again next week, and they're going to have to do better against them than what they did before. It's just going to have to be that way. Anyway, these are my thoughts about the trade deadline. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on Giants Baseball 101. Please subscribe if you have not. And you know where to email me, GabrielVaughn89@gmail.com.